I was standing outside a primary school in Shanghai last autumn, just as the final bell rang. It is a scene that plays out across East Asia every single day, but looking at it through a traditional Western lens, you would think you were witnessing a systemic collapse. Thousands of elderly people, grandparents with stooped backs and weathered faces, were lined up behind a perimeter fence, clutching oversized umbrellas and colorful water bottles. To a casual observer from London or New York, this looks like a tragedy. It looks like a welfare deficiency. A society so broken that it forces its retirees back into the grueling labor of childcare because the state has failed to provide a modern safety net. I watched one grandfather, his coat worn at the elbows, hoist 2 heavy backpacks onto his shoulders while his grandchildren ran ahead. He looked exhausted, a living portrait of what we have been taught to call an intergenerational burden. But then I considered where the parents were. They weren't there. They were in the semiconductor labs in Shenzhen, the high-precision factories in Suzhou, and the software hubs of Hangzhou. They were putting in 12-hour shifts, driving the most formidable industrial output the world has ever seen, completely unburdened by the logistical friction or the crushing costs of state-managed childcare. Suddenly, the scene shifted in my mind. Those grandparents weren't a patch for a broken system. They were a decentralized, high-efficiency mobilization of human capital that no government budget could ever replicate. While the West builds nursing homes that function as warehouses for the obsolete, this society has integrated its elderly into the very spine of its economic engine. What I was looking at wasn't a social failure. It was the ultimate moat, a silent intergenerational relay race that ensures while the West pays for the management of his own decline, East Asia is busy engineering the future. It made me wonder, is the freedom of the atomized Western family actually a luxury that is currently being outcompeted into extinction?
That is a really profound way to frame it. Because you're right, that image immediately gets to the core tension of what we're going to explore in this deep dive.
It's this massive economic engine, but it's completely hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. And our mission today is to really unpack that, to explore how these intergenerational systems, how we define family, how we pass down knowledge, and maybe most importantly, how we think about rights and duties, how all of that translates directly into economic competence.
And even into civilizational defense, as you put it.
Yes, very much so. We're going to be comparing these different models, the economic structures built on individual transactions versus those built on something more enduring, these non-transactional compacts.
And that's going to take us from the philosophy of Edmund Burke all the way to the modern behavioral science of grit. And then, then to the pressures that are threatening to tear this whole thing apart.
It's a huge arc, but it all connects.
Okay, so let's start with that first piece then. The pure economics of that scene I saw. This idea that relying on family for childcare isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's a high-efficiency economic system.
It absolutely is, and it flips a whole script on what we think of as progress. We see state-provided welfare as the goal.
Of course. It's modern. It's what developed nations do.
But this East Asian intergenerational model, it functions as this hidden economic engine. And it does that by maximizing the participation of what we'd call prime age labor.
So people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, the most productive years.
Precisely. That entire cohort is, they're freed up to work these incredibly demanding shifts in critical sectors. We're talking high-tech manufacturing, software development, advanced research. They can put in 12 hours a day, maybe 6 days a week, because they have this foundational trust that their children are being cared for.
And not just cared for, but cared for by a family member, often in their own home. There's no logistical friction.
None. And when you put that up against the Western model, the fiscal advantage is it's staggering. Our systems of socialized welfare, of state-managed childcare, they require this enormous bureaucracy.
Huge public spending, endless regulations.
It's an astronomical cost. Think about everything that the East Asian model just completely avoids. It's not just the direct salary for a government daycare worker.
No, it's the buildings, the maintenance, the licensing, the inspections.
The insurance, the subsidy programs, just to make it affordable for a middle-class family. When you take that entire function and handle it outside of the government budget through these robust family networks that aren't getting a paycheck for it.
You're saving a fortune. The state avoids a potentially bankrupting fiscal load.
Which means it can focus its resources elsewhere. It's a massive strategic advantage. It prevents the kind of deindustrialization that often comes with huge social spending. The government can pour money into infrastructure, R&D, defense, key industries.
Instead of managing the childcare for millions of tiny, atomized family units who all need to pay market rates.
Exactly. It's an economic moat. The system internalizes the costs of reproducing human capital, and the state gets to stay lean, focused, and strategic while its workforce is hyperproductive.
But like you said, this isn't just an economic hack. This is all built on a philosophical foundation that is just completely at odds with the modern transactional society.
It is, and this is where we have to bring in someone like Edmund Burke.
Right. His thinking on society and contracts is really the intellectual counter-argument to this atomized view that's so dominant in the West.
To get to Burke, we first have to understand what he's arguing against. And that's the liberal critique, which is really the default setting for most of us.
Which says that individual autonomy and equality are the highest possible moral values.
Yes. The basic unit of analysis is always the individual, the community, the collective, the historical continuity of a people. That all gets ignored or at least downplayed.
And when you focus that intensely on the individual, you get this radical individualism. Self-interest becomes the main driver of everything. Any sense of duty or sacrifice for others starts to look suspicious.
Like it's an attack on your personal freedom. And this fracturing isn't some accident of history. It's actively pushed forward by what we can call the handmaidens to atomization.
The market and the state.
The market and the state. Let's start with the market. Modern capitalism at its core values individual purchasing power. So to maximize profit, it actually benefits from social atomization. It wants to break up large, cohesive units like the family
into lots of tiny individual consumers.
Exactly. Can you think of an example?
The one that always comes to mind is the telephone. You know, back in the 80s, you had one household landline. It was a central point. It kind of reinforced the family unit.
Communication flowed through the parents, right?
Right. And now every single person in the house, parents, teenagers, even the 10-year-old, has their own personal cell phone.
So you've disaggregated the collective. You've turned one family unit into 4 or 5 individual revenue streams, 4 or 5 separate data points to market to.
So the market is always pushing to break things apart. And then the state, the second handmaiden, it comes in to pick up the pieces.
It does, because as this atomized world gets more lonely and insecure, the individual can't manage. Financial precarity, social isolation, the sheer impossibility of juggling work and life alone, like the childcare problem.
So people turn to the state for help.
They seek state assistance, welfare, subsidies, social services. And that assistance, ironically, just accelerates the atomization. It makes the traditional support systems, family, community, churchless essential.
And therefore less relevant. The state starts to replace those moral and social bonds.
And you end up in this strange situation where political rivals, say free market conservatives and big state progressives, are both, in their own way, speeding up the death of community. The market atomizes for profit, the state atomizes for control.
It's a real intellectual trap.
It is, and this is precisely where Burke's philosophy offers such a radical alternative. He just flatly rejects the idea that society is just some temporary business deal between individuals and the government.
It's not a commercial contract you can just tear up.
Not at all. He emphasizes the complexity of social life, the role of history, and the deep importance of emotional attachment, affection, feeling. That's what really binds people together.
And then this is his idea of the great primeval contract.
Yes, what he calls the eternal society. He says society isn't just a partnership in things for our gross animal existence. It's not just about today's grocery bill or this quarter's profits.
It's bigger than that.
Much bigger. For Burke, it's a partnership in all science, in all art, in every virtue, and in all perfection. And crucially, it's an intergenerational compact.
A compact not just between us, the living,
but between the living, the dead, and those who are yet to be born. It's a sacred web, a moral chain that connects the past, the present, and the future.
When you put it like that, the scene at the Shanghai school makes perfect sense. The grandfather picking up his grandkids isn't a commercial transaction. He's not sending an invoice.
He's fulfilling a duty rooted in this eternal compact. And that compact creates a stable social and economic framework. The traditional affections, like filial piety, they act as a buffer. They soften the harshness of purely self-interested market transactions.
It's the difference between a society where you only maintain relationships if they're profitable right now,
And a society where relationships are maintained because they represent a piece of that historical chain, and they're an investment in the future.
Let's drill down on that.
Yeah.
Because a core part of Burke's philosophy is this idea that rights come with corresponding duties. We in the West talk endlessly about our rights.
We do, and that's where Burke issues a major warning. For him, natural rights are real, they're universal, a birthright of our species. But their abstract perfection is actually their practical defect.
What does that mean, their practical defect?
It means if you take a pure abstract right, like the right to perfect untethered autonomy, and you try to just slap it onto the messy reality of a complex society, it becomes destructive. He warns it's like pouring a powerful acid straight into water. You get an explosion.
So rights have to be filtered, refined somehow.
They have to be. They must pass through the affections, the traditions, the manners and customs of a society before they become safe and compatible with the community. For Burke, rights exist to protect individuals, yes, but also the communities they live in.
It's a web. They preserve voluntary interactions, they produce prosperity, but they also support both the rights and the duties that come with them.
You can only safely claim your right when you understand and are ready to fulfill the duty that it implies for the good of the whole.
And he used the East India Company as his prime example of this, didn't he?
Oh, it was the perfect case study. The company had a charter. It was a grant of power, a monopoly from the sovereign. Burke saw this kind of political power as being, in his words, wholly artificial.
It wasn't a natural right like the right to life. It was a gift.
A temporary gift of public trust. And therefore, if you're given this artificial power, it must be exercised for the benefit of the people you rule. The charter gave them the right to govern, but that right was completely dependent on them fulfilling their duty to the Indian people.
So the company's legendary corruption and abuse, the resource extraction, the famines, that wasn't just a legal breach of the charter.
It was a moral breach, a violation of that deeper foundational compact. They abused the gift, that privilege was a sacred trust, and they failed. They built no bridges, no hospitals, no schools. They just harvested the present without investing a single thing in the future.
They break the chain.
They broke the chain. Burke argued that when that trust is broken so profoundly, society theoretically re-enters into all its rights, which means it can exercise all of its duties. It's the ultimate moral contrast to pure individualism.
And this non-transactional compass, this sense of duty from Burke's eternal society, is what we are seeing operationalized in East Asia today.
It is, and it acts as a strategic civilizational defense mechanism. It leverages those traditional family structures to reduce social transaction costs and to fight against the atomization that comes with Western individualism. It makes sure that the single most expensive and important thing a society does, raising the next generation, is socially internalized and maintained.
So if that duty to the future is the core of the compact, how does that actually translate into a competitive advantage? How do you get from filial piety to building world-class engineers?
That takes us right to the next piece of the puzzle, the so-called engineer dividend and the specific role of upbringing in creating it. And the key concept here is a non-cognitive skill called grit.
Right. Grit. The ability to work hard, to endure, to persevere through challenges, even when it's miserable. Sheer toughness.
And its importance really can't be overstated. Study after study shows that people with high levels of grit often succeed over people with higher raw cognitive ability, a higher IQ, who just lack that perseverance.
Talent isn't enough. You need the follow-through.
You need the follow-through. And there's a very clear cultural link here, tying grit right back to the collectivist societies and the Burkean ideas we were just talking about.
So grit is more common in these collectivist cultures.
It is. And in children who have what we call authoritative, demanding parents, these cultures, many heavily influenced by Confucianism, they value family relationships, interdependence, and filial piety. Education isn't just a path to a better job, it's a moral obligation. It's a source of cultural status.
And that cultural imperative gives rise to tiger parenting.
Yes, the term that became famous a few years back. It's a form of very strict, very demanding, relentlessly goal-oriented parenting. It's all about driving academic achievement or success in other high-status activities like classical music or competitive sports.
It involves a high degree of psychological and behavioral control. A huge emphasis on courtesy, respect, obedience.
And a very, very low tolerance for failure or behavioral problems. And what's really crucial to understand is that the parents in this model often don't see the stress they're putting on their children as a negative thing.
They see it as a sign of good parenting.
Exactly. They see it as preparing them for the brutal meritocratic competition of the real world. And it's all underpinned by a key philosophical difference.
Which is?
The view that academic success is a direct result of effort, not of some fixed inherent ability.
That's a huge distinction.
It changes everything. If you fail, it's not because you aren't smart, it's because you didn't work hard enough. So mistakes aren't seen as a sign of weakness or inadequacy. They're seen as skills you just haven't mastered yet. It's a fundamentally different psychological approach to failure than what you see in the West.
And this is where the cultural context is so important, right? Because generally speaking, authoritarian parenting in Western individualistic cultures is linked to poor mental health outcomes.
It is. In a culture where the child's individual autonomy is seen as the highest good, that kind of discipline can be interpreted as repression. Failure is internalized as a personal flaw.
But in a collectivist society, it's different.
It's perceived differently. The discipline is framed within the concept of filial piety, of fulfilling your duty to your family, of honoring your elders. So the external pressure isn't seen as an attack, it's seen as an expression of parental love and investment. The child's success is the family's success. The goal isn't just individual achievement, it's raising the status of the entire collective.
Okay, so let's flip that and look at the Western paradigm for contrast. Individualistic cultures like the US or Western Europe prioritize personal needs, autonomy, independence. And this often leads to a more permissive style of parenting.
Permissive parenting, right. It's characterized by being very responsive to the child's wants, but having very low demands. Parents just accept the child's impulses. They don't provide much structure or correction.
Few chores, few responsibilities.
And few real consequences for bad behavior.
Which leads directly to what people call the entitlement trap.
It's almost inevitable. Permissive parents, usually with the best intentions, they want their kids to be happy, so they shield them from struggle. They try to remove every obstacle from their path.
And the result is a child who expects obstacles to always be removed for them, who develops a false sense of self-worth that isn't tied to any actual accomplishment.
Exactly. And when they finally do fail at something, which everyone does, they don't know how to handle it. They blame other people, they blame the system. They've never learned how to just push through difficulty.
And that lack of accountability is just disastrous for success later in life.
The research on this is pretty clear. Permissive parenting is linked to immaturity, low impulse control, a real lack of self-reliance, and higher rates of narcissism. If you're raised in an environment with no real consequences and constant praise, regardless of merit, you often grow up lacking the deep discipline needed for complex, high-stakes work.
You lack grit.
You lack grit. So you have these two systems. One is optimized for maximizing collective output through strenuous shared discipline. The other is optimized for maximizing individual psychological comfort, often at the expense of resilience.
So researchers then tried to see if you could, replicate the successful parts of the collectivist model in a school setting?
They did. They looked into whether high-demand teaching methods could actually instill grit in students, particularly in low-performing schools.
And what did they find? What did the teachers who were successful at this look like?
They were often described as being very strict, but also deeply nurturing, a kind of tough love approach. They used traditional teaching methods, they valued respect and honesty, and they pushed incredibly high standards with very clear and consistent consequences.
So they were basically mimicking that high-demand parenting style, but in a supportive classroom environment.
That's a great way to put it. It was that combination of high demand and high support that seemed to mirror the collectivist ethos. But the most interesting finding wasn't just about the external discipline.
Okay.
The study found a very significant link between a student's level of grit and their personal perception of academic competence.
So how capable they felt in the classroom.
Yes. Specifically, whether they felt good at their schoolwork, whether they felt smart enough to handle the material, and whether they felt they could figure out the answers on their own. And this points to a powerful psychological feedback loop.
The discipline and high standards create actual competence.
That competence boosts the students' confidence, and that confidence in their own ability is the single strongest predictor of developing grit. The system starts to feed on its own success.
And that's the core of the Engineer Dividend. The non-transactional family compact frees up the parents. The cultural expectation of duty enforces the educational discipline. The discipline builds real competence, and that competence reinforces the will to persevere.
It's a remarkably robust loop, for a time.
For a time. And now we have to get to the contradiction, because despite this incredibly powerful system we've just described, it is now under, well, it seems to be under unprecedented stress. maybe even collapsing.
The numbers are just devastating. East Asia now has some of the lowest total fertility rates on the planet. I mean, South Korea is at 0.78.
0.78. That's a demographic cliff. China is at 1.23, Japan at 1.26. These are numbers from which there is almost no recovery.
It points to a fundamental crisis in that intergenerational compact. It suggests the rapid adoption of a low fertility norm, or in some cases, outright anti-natalist views across the entire region.
And the crisis seems to be fueled by the very success of the system. The rapid modernization and economic growth brought in these modern Western values that directly challenge the traditional family structure.
Values like individualism, self-realization, personal autonomy. Young people are prioritizing their personal goals, their career, their fulfillment, travel over the immense non-compensated duty of getting married and having children.
So the West's atomization problem is finally catching up with the East.
It is, but perhaps in an even more intense form because of the hyper-competitive environment there. And to really get a handle on this shift, we need to look at this fascinating study that analyzed over 200,000 social media comments about having kids across China, Japan, and South Korea.
It's like a raw, unfiltered look at the societal tension.
It really is. And what stood out immediately was the strength of this ideological shift, especially in China. Over 57% of the Chinese comments were about values. And of those, a full 30% were specifically about individualism.
The sentiment was clearly anti-natalist.
Overwhelmingly. The study rated it at 50.29% anti-natalist. And the phrases they pulled out are they're so clear. Things like, only by not having children can you enjoy life, and no kids mean freedom.
So it's not just that it's too expensive, it's an active choice for self-actualization over filial duty.
It's both. The antinatalism is being driven by those twin forces, deep economic anxiety and this rising tide of individualism.
Okay, let's break down the three main themes the study found in these online discussions. The first one is the most obvious: childrearing costs.
Right, and this was a huge factor in all three countries. It's a universal pressure. But South Korea really stood out. It reportedly has some of the highest child-rearing costs in the entire world, so naturally that's a major topic of conversation.
And were the financial worries the same across the board?
No, they were subtly different, and it shows the different anxieties. In China, the big concern was economic uncertainty. People were worried about job stability.
My wages aren't going up, so I don't dare have kids. That kind of thing.
Exactly. Fear of being laid off from one of those grueling tech jobs. It's a feeling of precarity, even in these supposedly booming industries. But in Japan, the most common cost people talked about wasn't just money, it was domestic labor.
The unequal burden.
The hugely unequal burden of housework and childcare that still falls on women in the traditional family model.
So in China, the fear is losing your job.
Yeah.
In Japan, the fear is being trapped in an unfair domestic arrangement.
That's a good summary. Now, the second dimension they looked at was the utility of children. So discussions about the purpose kids serve. And this is really the last stand of that old Burkean compact.
What do they find here?
This was fascinating. This dimension was consistently linked with the most pro-natalist feelings in all three countries. When people talked about continuing the family lineage or the emotional reward of having kids or the idea of intergenerational support in old age.
That's when they were most positive about having children.
Yes. Even with all the rising costs and pressures, that deeply ingrained cultural value of what children provide, emotionally, familially, is still a powerful counterbalance to the antinatalism.
Clearly not powerful enough, given the fertility rates.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the third dimension, values, where you can really see the conflict of modernization.
And this is where the psychological cost of the whole system really comes into view. In South Korea, the most common theme under values was conflict.
The tension between duty and pressure.
The immense tension between the sense of responsibility, filial piety, and the absolutely crushing pressure of raising a child in that hyper-competitive society. The comments were heartbreaking. I am a mother of 2 children. The stress of raising them has made me depressed.
It's the system internalizing and just breaking people down.
It is. And in Japan, the big theme was gender equality. You saw comments like, childless men should experience 10 months of natural childbirth before criticizing women's choices, a direct rejection of the traditional restrictive gender roles that come with parenthood.
And speaking of that pressure cooker, we have to talk about the direct human cost of the tiger parenting model. It's efficient for the national economy, but it's creating toxic exhaust.
The connection is becoming impossible to ignore. The intense pressure of these meritocratic systems is strongly correlated with negative mental health outcomes in children. anxiety, depression, even physical symptoms caused by psychological distress.
And when you create a society where academic success is everything, not achieving that can feel like a total failure of your existence.
Which is the ultimate tragic cost. This relentless pressure has been linked to the high suicide rates in East Asia, especially in South Korea, which has some of the highest rates in the developed world. It's a crisis that's even affecting very young children now.
The system is being forced to acknowledge that it's unsustainable.
It seems so. You're starting to see some parents back off from the strict discipline. Some schools are changing admissions requirements to try and ease the burden. It's like the culture that built this incredible competitive moat is now having to dismantle parts of it just to prevent a massive mental health catastrophe.
A critical tipping point.
Yeah.
And the social media study had one last interesting finding, right? About how people react to the government's message.
Yes. It found that in Korea and Japan, when people saw pro-natalist messages from mainstream media or official sources, their comments were more likely to be strongly anti-natalist.
So the official message is actually backfiring. Why?
It suggests a profound disconnect. When the state uses this grand rhetoric about national duty or the joys of family, it feels completely out of touch to a young person grappling with insane work hours and the fear of financial ruin. It feels like propaganda that ignores their reality.
It just creates a backlash.
It provokes antinatalist responses. It's a rhetorical failure. The state is speaking the language of duty, but the younger generation is forced to live in the language of transactional cost, and that mismatch just breeds hostility.
Okay, let's try to pull all this together. The economic engine of the East Asian model is powered by this profound, non-transactional intergenerational compact, Burke's eternal society in action.
A compact that maximizes prime-age labor and successfully transfers this competitive ethic, this grit, from one generation to the next.
It's the strength of duty and affection holding the whole economic structure together, creating a formidable moat against the kind of atomization we see in the West.
While the West, having largely abandoned that compact for individualism and a transactional social model, is now drowning in fiscal burdens and social isolation.
But the giant paradox here is that the very success of the Eastern system, the incredible speed of its modernization, is what introduced the individualistic values and financial pressures that are now dissolving that compact from the inside out.
The younger generation is choosing autonomy. They're reacting against the intense pressure, and it's pushing East Asia toward the very same antinatalism and atomization that has plagued the West. The defense mechanism is, ironically, consuming the future it was designed to protect.
Which brings us all the way back to Burke's original warning.
It does. His warning about applying abstract rights directly onto a society. He said it was like pouring acid into water. You get an explosion. Rights are fundamental. They're the birthright of our species, but they can't just be slapped on top of a community without being filtered through affection and tradition. The tension we're seeing play out now in both the East and the West is exactly that friction. It's the conflict between our universal natural rights to autonomy and self-realization and the local affectionate bonds, traditions, and duties that are needed to realize those rights without completely destroying the social fabric in the process.